Murphy.
Thank you, Chair. Is it 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Great. Thank you. I'd like to say I very much welcome this bill, and I do welcome reform in this area. And I do think that when we look at reform of our political systems and institutions, reform of local government is one of the most important areas where we can bring in reform because of the democratic deficit that exists there. You know, we take the example of the local elections, and there'll be local elections coming next year. People elect local councillors to represent them in their local area, but often it's the case that when that person is elected on their behalf, they don't have the necessary local powers to act on their behalf and to deal with the local issues appropriately. And we see this very much in a situation where an executive manager takes on many of the functions that one would expect the councillor to have, and therefore that person's democratic right, or that the responsibility of the person elected on behalf of the citizens isn't able to act accordingly. And that's what we talk about when we talk about a democratic deficit. And you know, when we talked about abolishing the dual mandate and when TDs were no longer allowed to serve as councillors, I think that was a good thing to do. What we didn't do is we didn't give councillors enough powers when we made that separation, and we didn't remove the TD far enough away from the local council's work. And so I think a great deal of reform still needs to be done there to make that separation true and to make it proper. I mean, in terms of the democratic deficit, just a quick example in relation to my own constituency. We have a project, the Poolbeg incinerator, which no elected person from the area is in favour of. And yet the city manager is able to proceed over a number of years. We're a decade gone now into that project, over 90 million spent and nothing built. And now recently we have a judgment coming from Europe saying that one of the contracts involved in that, which is overspent itself by more than 300%, is an illegal contract. And yet we can't get this project stopped, even though it's the mandate of the locally elected representatives from that area to try and have it stopped. Their voice isn't heard because they don't have the sufficient powers. That's a democratic deficit in effect, because the constituency doesn't want it, the local representatives don't want it, city council doesn't want it to happen. Yet the city manager does, and so it goes ahead. And the city manager in this case neither is that person responsible to the Minister for the Environment. So who is that person responsible to? Who is that office responsible to? We see in this case to no one really, and not the people whom they're meant to represent. And it's not a question of just a local issue. It's a question also that's come before the Public Accounts Committee because, of course, it is government spending. And when we try and investigate these areas in government spending, we find another problem in relation to the functioning of our local government is that we cannot appropriately investigate how government money, which goes from the central fund into the local fund, is then spent, and it's more than $5 billion every year. And that's a very important thing to do. If we're to ensure proper oversight of how public money has been spent and to ensure value for money, then we need to have the sufficient powers in the Oireachtas here for the committee and for the CNAG's office to be able to investigate that spend. It's important when we look to reform local government that we devolve powers. I think it's important in a country such as ours, and when we look at things like trust in government is at a low level according to different polls and according to recent referenda results. To bring greater trust into local areas, we need to devolve more power to our councillors and to our local authorities. We've also got to devolve revenue-raising powers. And that's why I suppose it's regrettable that when we saw a commitment come from the government that 80% of property tax raised locally will be spent in that local area, to roll back on that decision I think was a mistake. And I think it's absolutely imperative that that funding be put in place for 2015, that the money raised locally in a given area, be it in Dublin or in any part of the country, that 80% of that money raised be kept locally to be spent on local services, because that's what we told the people we would do. And I think we need to honour that as a result. Again, touching on the revenue-raising abilities of councils, when we look to the issue of rates, and we look to the fact that commercial businesses have had to carry the burden for so long, that when we bring in a whole new revenue-raising stream in terms of the local property tax, we should be doing something for ratepayers as well in terms of businesses. And I think, you know, to support Deputy Kerry's remarks in that regard, that section of the bill I think needs to be looked at again, and it needs to be improved and strengthened to make sure that we're not damaging businesses at a time when we need local businesses to survive and to thrive if the domestic economy is to pick up and move into growth next year, as it needs to, if all of the other assumptions underlying our budget correction are to be true. That part of the bill that deals with the size of local electoral areas, and we've seen this come forward in previous bills. I think a local electoral area that's an 8-seater, and I have one in my own constituency, I think it's too big. I don't think there's anything local about that kind of politics. If we want local people to represent their localities, their communities, an 8-seater, the size of the population, the size of the geography, I don't think it works in the best interests of local government. And I think that's something we need to look again in the future, in future bills. Dublin needs a directly elected mayor, and that's the final point I'd like to make. One of the good things about the reforms that we're bringing through is that we will hold a plebiscite of people in the Dublin regions next year alongside the local elections to see if they want to go for a directly elected mayor, hopefully along the model that's been adopted in London, because what we've seen in London, you know, London is the economic engine for the UK, Dublin is the economic engine for this country. we need to have a strong elected person with a mandate to move on areas like planning, on transport, on waste infrastructure, all these areas, so that we can have a competitive city and a city that people want to live in. And that's why I think that the proposal from this government to move to a directly elected mayor for Dublin is such a positive one. And I'd really like to emphasise that as part of the bill. I'd also like to just briefly, as I conclude, congratulate the Dublin Chamber of Commerce for all the good work they have done in trying to promote Dublin as a region for the country, and to try and bring in those aspects of political accountability that we need to see in the capital city. Thank you.